Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Also with me is Elise, Labott, Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the host of the Cosmopolitics podcast. Yamiche, let's start with you. Does it appear that we're any closer to a ceasefire in Ukraine after these phone calls today?
Look, it's a good question. President Trump has said that, quote, nothing could really go forward unless he spoke directly with President Putin. So it seems that means that there's a step in the right direction. But the president is also saying that, look, things are early. It's not clear whether or not this ceasefire is actually going to be negotiated. He said that both parties, both Ukraine and Russia, are now going to be talking to each other. And he also said that the Vatican has offered and noted that the Vatican has offered through the new Pope Leo XIV to be a place to host these negotiations. But I just don't think it's clear whether or not this 30-day ceasefire that European leaders, that the President Zelenskyy is pushing for, whether Putin is at all interested in that. And it's also really interesting that President Trump has really gotten a little bit more tougher on Russia. That, to me, shows that maybe he's trying to push Putin into making a deal here, but it's not clear just how far things are going to go and whether or not these talks are really going to lead to anything just yet, Ryan.
And do we have any idea, Yamiche, just what role the United States will play in these negotiations? The president making it clear in his post that Russia and Ukraine are going to start talking. But will there be a role for the United States in this process?
Well, it's an interesting thing that you asked, because I was rereading his post, and it was a long post. But in part of that post, he said that the two were going to be talking, and that it was really that the conditions for that have to be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be. So he's sitting there saying Russia and Ukraine need to talk, and this really needs to be worked out between the two of them. Of course, the United States is going to continue to be part of this, but the president is indicating that these two countries really need to get together and have that conversation. Of course, President Zelenskyy has said multiple times that when he and President Putin have kind of try to come up with a deal, that President Putin has broken pretty much every single deal. So it's clear that he also wants the United States and NATO to be part of those negotiations, Ryan.
And another kind of interesting wrinkle in the president's post this morning, Yamiche, was that he is talking about potential trade deals between the United States and Russia. This comes at the same time that he was also threatening new sanctions against Russia, which would be diametrically opposed to each other. How does the administration square these two things?
Well, in talking to White House officials, they really say that this is both a carrot and a stick sort of negotiation. The president does want to, and is continuing to say that he could put sanctions against Russia if he doesn't think that things are moving fast enough when it comes to peace talks and ending the war in Ukraine. But he's also saying over and over again that he wants trade deals with any single country that comes to the United States. This is a big priority for him. So they're saying, these White House officials are saying, it's not surprising that he's talking about having trade talks with Russia. The president overall wants to reset the relationship that the United States has with Russia. I should also point out that the president had said that Ukraine could benefit from a trade deal in rebuilding its country. So you can see there that the president is just really trying to eke out these trade deals as they happen.
Yeah, always thinking about the deal to be had in any situation. All right, Yamiche, thank you for that. Let's get the view from the other side of the Atlantic. Keir, what are officials in Moscow saying about the call between President Trump and President Putin?
Well, President Putin, Ryan, was the first out to talk to the media, talking to his own media, but knowing, of course, that though it was Russian state media, it would be shared pretty quickly. He, too, had a very kind of friendly, positive readout of the call. The Russians say that they called each other by their first names, that President Putin began by congratulating President Trump on the birth of a grandchild. So that's all well and good, but ultimately, while President Putin says that President Trump talked to him about there needing to be a ceasefire, he didn't agree to a ceasefire. Neither did he agree to meet with President Trump in person. And remember, it's just days ago that President Trump was saying that that was what was needed. And he, again, even in the interview with the Russian state media immediately after the call, repeated that Russia wants to see the root causes of this conflict addressed. And by that, he means that Ukraine should be largely neutral, that Russia should gain more territory than it already holds, a whole number of things that the Ukrainians aren't going to sign up for. So President Trump is putting a very positive gloss on this. But ultimately, if the idea is that the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, are going to get into a room and sort of hammer this out between each other, there is an ocean between them, and it's very difficult to see how they're going to come to an agreement.
And President Trump is saying that the negotiations are going to start right away, but we don't have any sort of tangible timeline, right? Nothing's been scheduled, right?
Yeah, it's a bit odd. Yeah, it's kind of odd. The true negotiations began on Friday because President Zelenskyy agreed to go to Turkey to meet with President Putin. President Putin had said there should be direct negotiations. President Putin didn't come, and he did send a delegation. Now, they didn't walk out of the room. The whole thing didn't collapse. They agreed, for example, to exchange 1,000 prisoners on each side, which is the most that's ever been exchanged during these 3 years of war. So there were positives, but they equally didn't agree to a ceasefire, and they didn't come to terms. Again, the issue here really is that the Russians and Ukrainians are in very different places. The war grinds on. On the Russian side, for example, they still are able to funnel troops, funnel new recruits into their military. And although that may not be the case in years to come, for now it is. And that, therefore, means President Putin, he's openly stated this, thinks that he can gain on the battlefield as well as in negotiations. I think we may look back on this day, this moment, and say this was the moment that President Trump walked away from all of this, realising that he couldn't get the ceasefire, the deal that he had hoped to get.
Yeah, and part of the reason we may draw that conclusion is because, while Donald Trump is talking about a ceasefire, the reality on the ground is much different, right? I mean, there was a massive aerial bombardment of Ukraine over the weekend. Things would have to change dramatically on the front lines to get to a place where a ceasefire would be any sort of a reality, right?
Yeah, dramatically. And, I think in many ways it's a good idea to pay attention to what the Russians do as much as what they say. But they say very openly that they do believe, and President Putin said it in an interview just in the past days, just before this call, he says very openly that he believes that Russia can achieve its goals militarily as much as it can potentially achieve its goals through talks. So what effectively he is saying, and he has been saying this the entire time, is that he hopes that the talks can achieve what he wants. But if they don't, then he's perfectly happy, perfectly prepared, perhaps not happy, to continue the war. And that's the fundamental challenge here. Again, President Trump said that he could get this solved very, very quickly. At the moment, that is not looking like what is going to happen.
Okay, Keir Simmons, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Let's turn now to Elise Labott. Elise, if it doesn't seem like there's any progress on a ceasefire deal, what was the point of this call today?
Well, I mean, it's good that the sides keep talking and they're, agreeing at least to that they want, in theory, to have a solution to the war, to an end to the war. And I think what you have is President Putin willing to humor President Trump a little bit. He knows that President Trump wants a better relationship. He wants to reset relations with the Russians. And so he's willing to talk to him. But again, as Keir said, on his terms. There was no progress today. They were obviously on opposite sides. You have the U.S. and Ukraine and the Europeans wanting this 30-day ceasefire. And President Putin said no. So until he gets what he wants, which is basically Ukraine's unconditional surrender with a lot more territory than they even have now, the talks aren't going anywhere. So I think what President Putin is trying to do is keep the idea of talks alive and keep humoring the United States, because now, President Trump, Vice President Vance, they're talking about sanctions. They're talking about maybe walking away. Vladimir Putin doesn't want the international community to walk away. He wants to keep them at the table. But really, it's just kind of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, maybe expand on that a little bit, because I'm a little perplexed because we've heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say the same thing. Now we hear Vance saying it as well, that the United States might just, get out of this game and leave it to them to decide. How does that work as a leverage point in these talks?
Well, the question is, when the U.S. says it's going to walk away, what does that mean? Does it mean that it's hands off, you guys go keep killing each other and we're done with it? Or is the U.S. going to walk away but continue to support Ukraine, to continue to give that aid, to continue to give them weapons, to work with the Europeans on additional sanctions? That might not be so bad for the Ukrainians, because right now the Russians have the upper hand. If the U.S. is just going to walk away and leave the Ukrainians to fend for themselves, that's essentially giving a victory to Putin. So I don't think the Ukrainians certainly don't want the U.S. to walk away. Would Vladimir Putin want the U.S. to walk away and be able to do what he wants? Because, as Keir said, he does think he can have victory on the battlefield. But, look, the sanctions are continuing to hurt Russia. He would like to have a better relationship with the U.S. So I think he's going to keep inching along, making it like he's going to talk. But, you know, unless there's someone that's really going to crack those skulls and get together, I don't see the Ukrainians and the Russians being able to get it together themselves.
Of those two paths you described, though, of the United States walking away, I mean, Putin has to be aware of what's happening on this side of the Atlantic, right? He knows that there's not any sort of inertia by congressional Republicans to continue the funding to help support Ukraine, right? I mean, is that a bet he might be willing to take for the U.S. to walk away?
Well, you know, I think you see President Trump as his unpredictable, right? Mm-hmm. Why were Republicans so reticent? Because the MAGA crowd was reticent. Because President Trump was reticent. Yeah. I think you've heard President Trump over the last, 6 weeks or so, coming to the conclusion that, you know what, I really want to be friends with Vladimir Putin. He's, want to be best friends. He could be playing me. Yeah. And so if President Trump is going to, start to lose favor with President Putin, he might want to get tough. And then, the Republicans, as we've seen since he could fall in line. And then you see Republicans wanting to throw money at Ukraine like they used to.
Yeah, he definitely has the ability to move mountains when it comes to congressional Republicans.
I think he's starting to, realize what's really going on. And look, President Trump, again, really is enamored of this strongman President Putin, but he doesn't like to look like a chump, and he doesn't like to look like a loser. And so if he can get the better of Vladimir Putin, I think he may try to do it.
Well, we'll see. That'd be a remarkable about face. But Elise Labott, your expertise is always appreciated.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.